Chapter 6. Butcher. Why did you bring her here? I shrugged and gave Armand my most bored expression. I didn't. She brought me. I warned you we were coming. He glowered at me, arms crossed as his eyes glimmered and shifted, only a little bit, but I should probably loosen my stance and check my knives. I specifically warned her against coming to Border Town. When? Tonight. I smiled at him. I don't recall you being at Candlestick tonight. He glowered at me. The Greek wanted to see her. I winced. I'd really hoped that the Greek would forget about her and vice versa. What did he want? He shrugged. Like I understand him. They bonded over hair and pizza, so now he thinks she's his pet. Wants to make sure the butchers are taking care of the fuzzy little sweater girl. I still had her fluffy green sweater in my room at Calder. I wanted to keep it. Until I had her in my room at Calder, or wherever she wanted to stay. My stomach lurched at the thought of Violetta in my bed, my room, my life like that. The CM thought I should marry her. Soon. You look a little bit sick. I don't think he's a serious threat. Otherwise I would have ended him. I shook my head and glanced out the window to study Violetta where she sat. With her head bent, completely focused on the phone, the last traces of her mother. The CM thinks I should marry her before Harmony gets here. He made a choking sound that I wasn't sure was laughter or something else. He grinned at me and shook his head. The CM has come a long way. He doesn't want you to abandon the butchers and take up with vampires, does he? I glared at him. The vampire lifestyle doesn't appeal to me. Well, you can't be a werewolf. I shook my head. There are certainly enough daughtry werewolves in the world. How many wolves do you have here? You told her that you knew how many there were. His eyes gleamed. I slowly smiled back at him. I meant the city. You have 32 wolves. Here. 31, one of them took off while I was fixing the roof. You think she needs that much protection? He shrugged. The girl cured werewolves. We don't have a precedent for this. I don't suppose we do. What do you know about the city's seals? The werewolf seal, the vampire seal, and the zombie seal? I shook my head. No, in a cellar somewhere a couple of brass lids hold back some really bad stuff. He raised his eyebrow. I don't think you're supposed to talk to werewolves about that kind of thing. I'm actually sure of it. I grinned at him. Thanks for the reminder. Apparently the mysterious renegade leader had Sebastian and Anthony go down and bleed on the seals. That's why this year's darkness is extra thick. He growled at me. Not for werewolf ears. I widened my eyes at him. Excuse me, is this too much responsibility for you to handle? Don't worry. I just thought you should know that a couple of butchers are going down into the depths tonight to check it out. His jaw clenched. Why should I know about that? With butchers otherwise occupied, tonight would be a good night for a werewolf slaughter. Don't you think? He growled, a long low sound, and I could tell his hackles were up at least. His metaphorical hackles. The CM thinks this broken seals problem is my problem. I patted his shoulder. I really enjoyed making him uncomfortable. If you were running away from responsibility, you probably shouldn't have become pack leader. Also, this monster is targeting your kind. What seems like a former butcher turned vampire or something else even more dangerous. I wonder what butcher would want to destroy you. He showed his teeth in what may have looked like a smile to someone else. Has it ever occurred to you that I wasn't running from anything? I took a step away from him. No, it hasn't. I'll see you. He growled. Keep her out of Border Town. I cocked my head. I'll keep her safe. I'm not locking her up. She's my baker. Not my pet. There's something wild about her. If I try to hold on to her too tight, she'll disappear. If she ends up in Border Town alone, she'll disappear all right. Get her back to Candlestick. My wolves want to meet her. And that would be such a bad thing? He scowled at me. She's terrified of Mrs. Maverly. She doesn't need to know that her good friend Armand thinks about eating her every time he sees her. As long as that's the only thing you want to do to her. He laughed and slapped my shoulder. That would be funny if anything else. Wouldn't kill her. Get out or I'll eat you. Fun chat. Violetta glanced at me when I got in the car, stuffing the phone away and trying not to sniffle. Her emotions were fascinating to me. Her sadness as beautiful in its way as her glowing happiness. It was my job to make her happy, to protect her life, health, and happiness. I held her against me because she needed me but didn't want to need anyone. I'd worked so hard to stay away from her, to not pour my energy into her every moment, to take her and carry her somewhere far away and keep her safe and mine. I cared so much. It was worth it, though, watching her bloom as a baker, knowing that I wasn't the only one who would protect her with my life, having Landry to watch over her, keeping her away from every butcher who might be a threat. He'd always had an open kitchen where butchers could come and go, but not anymore. He watched me when I was with her but didn't try to keep me away. He knew me well enough to know that only my own concern for her would influence me about something I wanted so much. I could be willful at the best of times. With Landry as her guardian, I didn't need to be quite as protective and overbearing as I might be otherwise. I drove with her against me, her arms around my waist, head on my shoulder, seatbelt stretched past the point of usefulness. I should say something about her mom, but what? I tightened my arm around her and felt the steady ebb and flow of my energy into her. By the time we reached Candlestick, I felt loose and heavy, but only enough for it to be very hard to pull away from her. I couldn't. I sat there in the garage, away from prying eyes, and hoped that somehow she'd decide that she needed to kiss me. Orion, what are you going to do after you're finished being a butcher? I cleared my throat. Become the CM after my father, and be responsible for all the other butchers under my jurisdiction. Somehow I doubted she wanted to hear that. But it was true. There was a balance between truth and diplomacy that I tried to keep. If I told Violetta the truth from the beginning without softening her up a bit, she'd run into the woods and never come back. Like if I told her that my father only allowed our relationship to flourish in Candlestick because he wanted her to give him grandchildren, the reaction wouldn't be good. I'm going to college next year, but I'll probably still butcher. It's a seasonal thing. The paperwork is eternal, but the actual nightly battles are only intense from October to January. She looked up at me, only the side of her face visible in the dim light. So, it's like an extracurricular that you can keep up as long as you like? What about Landry? Is it seasonal for him? Good question. He bakes less intensely most of the year than these dark days. He's kind of boring though. Doesn't do much besides hang around in his indecent swimwear around the pool in the summer. You're kind of lucky that you didn't see him in the off-season. She giggled, her body shaking against mine. I definitely preferred her, trembling from laughter to fear. It's so strange to me, the way that all of you live like this is normal. I thought I'd try it and then go to college in the fall, start my real life. There's no reason to wait. You can take classes in January starting with a new semester. You're brilliant, so for you to balance academics with baking will be nothing. Why not be a baker and whatever else you want to go into? Bumped her head with my chin. What else do you want to do? She hesitated. I thought botany like my mother, and maybe chemistry with a culinary arts degree. That does sound indecisive. I exhaled. That sounded like precisely the sort of academics that would lend themselves to her staying close to me. Calder University is renowned for its chemistry and botany programs. She elbowed me, but gently. You're making that up. I laughed and grinned at her. I would have, but I didn't have to. Honestly. Google it. Calder has amazing programs in science. The math program isn't bad either. They do not have a gymnastics team though. Isn't it a boys' college? I shook my head. Gender neutral, although most of the students are men. Most are also butchers or from butcher families who are no longer practicing. She looked up and let go of me to trace my cheek with her fingers. What does that mean, no longer practicing? I cleared my throat as she continued stroking my face, each touch sending a thrill of pleasure through me. Some families lose their ability to change into butchers over time, but you never know. Sometimes there's a throwback. And those families are still viable options for marriage. Marriage, I'd said the word and it hadn't come out strangled. Viable options? That sounds medieval. I laughed, but it was half strangled. How could I possibly broach this topic? Well, have you seen the architecture? Medieval is kind of our thing. Although the cars are a definite improvement. So, she said hesitantly, and I held my breath. You can only marry people who have butcher ancestors. No. I can marry whoever I want, but my children won't be great butchers. Unless. So that's why Olivia was the one, so that your children could be really great butchers. I took a tiny breath. Something like that. She has good lines. Violetta laughed, but not quite a cute giggle. She did not like me saying that. Olivia had good lines. I meant her ancestry is good, not her personal lines. She laughed again and pulled away from me, taking my face in her hands. Orion, can I kiss you? I exhaled in relief. I thought you'd never ask. She sucked on her bottom lip while she studied me. One thing. My Aunt Lottie always looked down on my mom. Was it because my mom has bad lines and does that mean that I'm not? I cut her off, cupping her cheek and glaring at her. You cured werewolves. Clearly your mother had very strong lines, just like your father. She blinked at me and I realized that I'd been a little too rough. But my aunt didn't want my mother with her brother. I'm sure it wasn't your lines. Your lines are perfect. I brushed her lips with mine and my heart thrummed from that contact. But not as good as your lines, she whispered, tangling her fingers in my hair and kissing me a little bit longer. You cured werewolves. Your lines are going to be legendary. I kissed her, lingering on her soft lips, the hunger growing with every touch, every brush against her. When she kissed me in earnest, twisting until she was on my lap, I had to hold myself very firmly to keep my instincts from taking over. I let her kiss me, barely reciprocating because I wanted so much to pull her against me and make her feel adored. Beyond that was a very real danger of me becoming lost in her or losing myself and hurting her balance. She pulled away and stared at me, her eyes luminous. I wasn't going to kiss you until I decided whether I liked you for you or your energy. Interesting and terrifying. What's the verdict? She shook her head. I like both so much it's impossible to say. Are you going to need to take polar bear placenta every time I kiss you?
Ich grinste her.
I felt very much like I wanted to taste her and nothing else. For the rest of my life. That wasn't a good sign. Probably. Landry hasn't forbidden me to kiss you. That's also good. She frowned at me. Why would he do that? I waved my hand around, ending with my fingers brushing over her soft hair. Oh, I don't know. Something about bakers protecting each other. Her lips pursed, her beautiful lips. I couldn't help but kiss her, only for a moment that became 2 and then 3 before I managed to pull away. She shook her head at me. It's your sexy car. It makes you irresistible. The Greek wants me to be able to defend myself against butchers. I nodded. Good idea. You should be able to defend yourself against Greeks, too. I gripped her fingers. That Armand had watched the bogeyman's encounter with Violetta didn't quite assure me for some reason. She cocked her head at me. Why don't you get along with him?
Ido.
I think I'm going there for my next haircut. Do you want to come with me? It can be a date. She wrinkled her adorable nose. I've heard of those things, but I think they're mythical. Next week, Monday, we'll go to the botanical gardens. I'll take you directly after school. It closes at 5. How about we meet there? I hesitated. It was far from border town, but still, letting Violetta go anywhere unescorted was unthinkable. I'd arrange someone to look after her. I'd talk to Landry. Maybe he could give her a ride and hang around until I got there. That wouldn't be at all strange. I smiled. Perfect. 3:15. 3:45. I sighed. You don't want me to break any traffic laws. You're such a good influence. And then on Wednesday we're going to throw knives. And then on Saturday, haircut. Is that too much? She laughed and grinned at me. I don't think that I could ever get too much of you or Ian Daughtry. I kissed her again. How could I possibly resist, but I managed to pull away. Before the CM said anything, he was in the shadows of the garage watching, making certain that I didn't do anything reckless, like kiss a baker. I hadn't noticed him come in, which said how wrapped up I was in Violetta. After I walked her to the bottom of the steps, the ones that led to her turret, she frowned at me. I took too much energy from you. You must be hungry. I shrugged. There's always Landry's bread. And polar bear placenta. She wrinkled her nose and shook her head. To be honest, I can't sleep. I have to bake. I don't even know what, which means it's probably going to be awful. What time are you leaving tonight? I checked the time, which wasn't how most people check time. Could feel night coming on, the darkness coming to life. Soon. It will probably be a long night. She dragged me away from the stairs and to the kitchen where she rummaged around until she found the pink tablets that I took without complaint. Kissing her was worth any price. The tablets were like getting a shot of adrenaline. She packed a small bag with a variety of baked goods and sent me on my way. I stood in the doorway while she moved to the flour bin to begin her baking. Watched her for a few minutes before I finally turned and headed to my father's office. He stood at the board, which was empty except for one card with Tansetta murders in the center of it. Did you warn the werewolves? He asked without turning around. I did. Armand was delighted. Indeed. You're taking Sebastian with you tonight. I inhaled deeply but didn't say anything. If he wasn't going to mention me kissing Violetta, I wouldn't complain about anything. It's almost time. The darkness is growing. Will you need retirees tonight?
No.
I don't want too many butchers out, just enough to show that we're fighting the right demons. There hasn't been any sign of renegades since All Hallows. He glanced over at me, his eyes concerned. You seem well satisfied. Thank you. He raised an eyebrow. I knew perfectly well that had been a warning not to get cocky instead of a compliment. Tonight will be arduous. Don't push yourself too much. I grinned at him. I'll make a point of it. Casper and Merlot will also be with you. I stopped smiling. Will they? He nodded. We've given her a week of isolation, but this is the butcher headquarters. She has to become accustomed to other butchers and they have to get used to her. I inhaled deeply. And if a butcher oversteps himself? His lips twitched. You mean taking advantage of her, kissing her? Touching her against her will? He shook his head. Landry will oversee her. And you'll oversee Landry. I'll oversee you. Any other butcher she'll fight off and he will pay the consequences. You are the only actual risk. I scowled at him. Her mother left for some reason. Yes. He frowned and shook his head. He knew but didn't want to tell me? I already knew that Landry was Violetta's father, so the mother had to have been close to him. Bakers marrying bakers was perfectly acceptable. Of course, Landry had been a butcher first. Had he had the sort of relationship with Violetta's mother that I wanted with her? Her taking his energy and baking for him? No, of course not. Did Landry hurt her? My dad frowned at me. Not that way. I feel that it's not my story to tell. But you should know. Laurel was assaulted by a butcher, after she interned here with Landry and they became close. Laurel came to me, told me that a butcher had forced his energy on her, but I didn't believe her. The butcher in question was very well known, respected, and she had no proof. Landry still hasn't forgiven me for that. That's why she turned her back on our world. Because I chose to believe a butcher over her. When she asked Landry to join her, he refused loyalty to butchers and all that, which was only another betrayal to her. He didn't know about the charges until later, after I interviewed bakers about that butcher and dug up a few interesting facts about his lack of respect for bakers and women. I clenched my jaw for a moment before I could speak in a calm voice. You're the reason that the Tansettas weren't protected. He shrugged and ran a hand over his face. I'm the CM, so everything is my responsibility. Judging correctly is essential. I failed. Since then I've made certain that bakers are revered in our district. It hasn't always been so, but since I've made rigorous requirements, we've been getting steadily better bakers, and the whole district has prospered, at least until your brother. But you're the CM, so you're responsible for that as well. He gave me a hard glance. Yes. I'm not making the same demands on you as we put on him, because that resulted in disaster. And if that was the wrong choice, it will also be my responsibility. If you end up hurting her, I will personally take your skin from your flesh. You're welcome to. I hesitated. That was the first we've kissed since she came to stay. I know. I turned and stalked out. That night's hunt was fairly intense, but with Casper, Merlot and Sebastian around me, the rest of the butchers spread out behind, we weren't overrun. Midnight to 3 a.m. we fought above Border Town, pushing back the zombies and an unfortunate group of wraiths, pushing until the battle was won for the night. I turned to my bakers and raised my whip. They hurrahed and raised their whips in return before they headed back through the streets to the courtyard where the bakers' goods waited. I accompanied them but fell in beside Sebastian on the way. After we get some bread, you're going to lead us to the broken seal. He turned to stare at me for a second before he nodded. Olivia took her place close to him and bumped him with her hip. He staggered almost into me before recovering. Olivia had extremely capable hips. Olivia. I nodded at her, then moved away from the pair. Olivia, apparently feeling like flirting with a butcher after a hunt, wasn't at all awkward. The other butchers tried not to look at her, except Francis, who stared at the two with a wide grin on his face. At the courtyard, a butcher's boy came up to me, his eyes tired from being on delivery duty for the night. "Orion, Landry sent these to you special." I took the bundle he handed me, but when I inhaled, it wasn't Landry but Violetta I smelled. She'd given me something very special. Sausage stuffed rolls. I ate most of them, then stuck them into my pockets for later. And maybe I'd share with Merlot and Sebastian. Maybe. Not Casper. Casper grinned and came up to me, eyeing my bulging pockets. "So tonight's just begun. Are you fed?" He nodded. "Moderately. I imagine you've been fed a much more satisfying supper than I've ever had. Is it the kissing that enhances her baking, or is it her baking that makes her impossible to stop kissing?" I ignored him and broke into a jog. Merlot came alongside me soon enough then. Sebastian's footsteps pounded until he caught up with our small group. Sebastian took the lead, his pace quick. We moved quickly, quietly, holding to the shadows. The only monsters we found we took care of quickly, silently. Before continuing on our way, we reached a field and Sebastian scrambled in the ground until he pulled up a worn trapdoor. I held it open for Merlot and Casper to descend ahead of me. Gave the empty field one last glance before heading down. "Maybe should have done this during the day," Merlot muttered ahead of us. Sebastian held a flare as he walked ahead, apparently fearless in the face of who knew what. I went slower, taking my time as we passed shelves of antique pickles and peaches, through another narrow door into a small passage that descended in uneven steps until it came out in a square space with a wooden door in the floor. Sebastian opened it and began down an old ladder that groaned beneath his weight. I put my arm on Casper when he was about to descend, one at a time. Merlot nodded at me. He appreciated caution. Strange he wasn't a CM of course he'd never had connection. We stood in the dark, feet below ground, waiting for Sebastian to wave the flare below. After that, Casper went, leaving me with Merlot. "I'd watch out for him," he said barely under his breath. He looked down after Casper. "Do you think that he's a danger?" Merlot glanced at me. I knew what he meant. Casper was a danger. Probably to Violetta. Casper's a fine butcher, but there's a reason he doesn't have his own district. "And you, there a reason that you don't?" He gave me a thin smile. "Indeed. You know perfectly well." I put my hand on his shoulder. "You're an excellent butcher." He studied me soberly. "It takes all kinds. I don't connect much. Casper connects too much, and you are just right." I pulled my hand away. "It's not connection that makes the butcher. No, it's connection that makes the CM. It's interesting, his decision to upset conventions and allow you to connect so deeply with a baker." I cleared my throat, looking past him into the hole where Casper was nearly to the bottom. "Indeed. Do you think anyone will object?" Merlot shrugged. "It's not the first time it's happened. There are reasons to go both ways. After what she did with the wolves and you, it's hard to know. You'll probably have competition coming, though, soon if I don't miss my guess." He turned and headed down into the pit, leaving me to exhale deeply and try to think about seals instead of bakers. Merlot was right. If the CM allowed me access to Violetta, there was no reason he wouldn't allow others the same, if she chose. I rubbed the back of my neck until finally Merlot jumped off the end of the ladder. I climbed down quickly, silently, until I reached the floor of the immense cavern. Merlot, Casper, and Sebastian were all in different directions, stooping to check for strange scents and searching the enormous space. When I got to the floor, I whistled low and headed for Sebastian. He'd let the flare go out, so we were operating in pitch black. Didn't bother any of us. Darkness only made our other senses stronger. I followed him until he reached the center of the space, or at least closer to the center and away from the one wall. "Here it is," he whispered. I bent down and felt the rim of a 2-foot hole. It didn't have a lid on it. An icy breeze wafted from the pit, like a wraith over my wrist. I turned on a light, shining it around the perimeter of the hole, then took pictures of the marks in the uneven stone around the edges. The marks were butcher marks of protection, safety, and the metal rim bore the same. "Show me the other seals." He led me to 2 other spots that had brass lids. I took pictures of the words and images graven into them, then stopped, staring at the center seal and the warning on it. Whoso breaks the seals will surely pay the price in blood. Once undone thrice. Must be made anew. Beware. Darkness and men and monsters brood. To the butchers. Ye must be true. The first one said the same thing, Sebastian said in a low voice just behind my shoulder, making me jump. I turned on him with a glare. And you decided that meant you should bleed on it. He shrugged. We had to pay the price in blood to break the seal. Why did they put it backwards like that? It's a warning, Merlot hissed low. You aren't done paying for that in blood. And your blood doesn't mean your personal blood, but the blood of your fellow butchers. Butcher Baker. Werewolf Savior. Julian Wick. Chapter 1. Baker. Candlestick Manor loomed above me. I stood before the enormous door, ancient. Metal bands stretched over the dark wood. It could have been ornamental, but it wasn't. Like the latch, the small barred window in the center of the door. The inset windows with decorative grillwork all around the bottom story, yeah. No. Those weren't decorative either. This place was a fortress, and I was about to step inside and face a whole slew of butchers like the butcher holding my hand. I glanced over at Orion. His dark brown eyes were serious, but then he smiled. And my mouth watered for chocolate. His eyes were melted milk chocolate, his hair the darkest fudge, his skin white whipped cream with just a dash of mocha. He was enormous, a good head and a half above me, his physique absolute perfection beneath the black clothing he always wore. Don't be afraid. You belong here. His voice was delicious, utterly delectable, low and purring. I took both of his hands in mine and gazed at him. Tell me what your favorite breakfast food is. I'm not going in until I know. He frowned in concentration. You ask the most difficult questions. I would have to say cream puffs, the kind you make at 3 a.m. That counts as breakfast, right? I pulled my hand away and wagged my finger at him. Listen, butcher. If I'm supposed to be your baker, I need to know the truth. No hiding things from me. Whether it's favorite breakfast foods or fairies. Now spit it out. He caught my finger and leaned closer to me, so close that I could feel his exhale on my cheek. I really don't know. When I was younger, I used to go out at night with my brother, and when we snuck back in because I wasn't supposed to be out with him, he'd make me toast and bacon with orange juice. I raised my eyebrows. Toast and bacon? I really asked for that, didn't I? You're right, you have no idea what you like. I bit my bottom lip and faced the door. I had to go in. It wasn't ever easy for him to talk about his brother. Do we knock or what? He laughed low while he reached past me, turned the handle and pushed it open. The hall beyond was enormous, gleaming polished wood with white candles lining the dark wood floor. Above, chandeliers held candles, only surely they wouldn't have actual candles. Could you say fire hazard? They're real candles. The CM takes his position seriously. I glanced at him and gave him a slight smile. Okay, we came, we saw, we can leave now, right? He pulled me in and shut the door behind me. It thudded loud and echoing through the hall. Absolutely. Just as soon as you've met the CM, eaten dinner, and talked with Landry about what you want to do. I stood there for a minute, gathering my focus as though I were about to perform a difficult floor routine. I pulled my hand out of his, wiped my palms on my black skirt and started forward. Orion fell in beside me, his long stride matking mine. Are you sure you don't want to hold my hand? I glanced at him, then forward, focusing on the floor I covered with steady, fearless steps. Do I look afraid to you? He brushed me with his arm. No. You're the bravest girl I know. Think I like holding your hand or something? I couldn't help smiling, but I had to push it away to focus. This was serious business. This was a whole world I barely understood, a whole life ahead of me that I couldn't even imagine. I had to look at this like a job interview. Was going to intern with Landry so I could be a professional baker for Orion. So I could know what I was doing the next time werewolves attacked, and all I had to beat them off were biscuits and a rolling pin. The memory of their snapping teeth, their snarls echoing off the metal cabinets of the kitchen at Calder School for Boys had me gripping my skirt for a moment before I smoothed it down. My mother had always taught me to stand up straight and show no fear. If she'd been a baker, why did she run away from that world? Why hadn't she told me about what I was explained about the energy transfer, the need I had for the energy of a strong butcher, and most importantly, the dangers of the world around me, dangers that had taken her from me? I shoved those thoughts far from my head, but I grabbed Orion's hand only for a second, squeezing his fingers hard before I walked forward once more on my own. We reached two enormous doors held open by stone gargoyles to keep out evil spirits. I walked through the door towards an enormous bonfire that leapt and flickered in the round room beyond. Candles wound around the room on shelves, thousands of candles, but they weren't lit. Orion closed the doors behind us, then hesitated. He bowed to the room, then turned to the right while he pulled something out of his coat. It was a lighter blue and white plastic, one of the cheap kinds you get at a gas station. He lit the largest candlelight ever seen. The flame leapt up like a sparkler, and one of the sparks caught the next candle, slightly smaller, and the next, the flame racing around and around. Sound built, a murmuring hum that started with Orion and continued as the butchers inside the round hall made that sound, a low chanting like monastery monks. The sound echoed off the walls and inside my chest, the thrumming going on and on as the light spread from one candle to the next. Hundreds of candles wrapped around the room, several shelves on top of each other. I watched the candles, craning my neck as the flame spread to the candles above the doorway. The flame wrapped around the walls twice, Orion's voice growing in volume, until at last the whole room was ablaze around the central bonfire, and every butcher stood, lending his voice to the whole. Come, boys. A voice of quiet power flooded the room, cutting through the humming. Young boys started forward, ducking between the larger butchers, climbing over the tables that surrounded the bonfire. A boy came up to me and hesitated while his eyes got bigger and bigger before he turned to Orion and whispered, "Is she the one who saved the werewolves?" Orion grinned at the kid and slapped his shoulder while he glanced at me. She's my savior as well." The boy grabbed my hand and tugged me forward, away from Orion, who stayed by the giant candle, smiling at me with deepest satisfaction. I kept looking at him for too long before I remembered that I wasn't some tourist. I was a baker. I belonged here. I didn't feel like I belonged there. I saw a few female butchers, Olivia, who stood staring at me with a frown while Sebastian whispered something in her ear, Maria, her friend, who gave me a stony glare. But then Francis winked at me, and the whole thing became surreal. All of these boys from school, goofy, ridiculous teens, looked different in the candlelight and the flickering bonfire. Maybe it was all the black. Maybe it was the other butchers behind them, men I'd never seen who carried themselves with dignity and readiness. That's what Orion was like. I almost looked back at him but caught myself. I was here as myself, not as his girlfriend or something. "Welcome," a butcher murmured to me as I passed. Did I know him? Yes, I sort of did. He was the blonde guy who had been here that one time Orion had come for a meeting. The first time we'd kissed. I hadn't kissed Orion in what felt like hours. I pressed my lips together and continued up the first step between the tables that circled the room. On the 6th tier, the boy led me to a group of black-clad men who had a completely different aura about them. The butchers were serious, these were deadly. Was this the assassin branch of butchers? Landry stepped out of the black figures and gave me a rough bow, the movement showing his black rolling pin tucked into his coat. Was it metal or stone? Spikes? Violetta Tancetta. Welcome to the Bakers Guild. I tried not to look surprised at the grim-looking bunch with their weaponized rolling pins who nodded at me seriously. I recognized Puffer, my uncle's baker, in the back, giving me one of those nods beneath a terrifying scowl that made his usual expression positively docile. Thanks. I forgot my rolling pin. Landry smiled, showing his white teeth and for a moment looking slightly less terrifying. His light green eyes glowed in the candlelight as he gestured me forward to be embraced by the baker bunch. Look at her, fellas. She's nervous. Doesn't know if she's up to baking seriously. His English accent wasn't posh but Cockney. I took a deep breath and smiled back at him. I never knew I was supposed to be pimping my pin. Yeah, I'm a little intimidated. Those are sick. He laughed and grabbed my shoulder, pulling me into the space that they'd opened for me. Don't worry, he said in a low voice. We only have to put on a show 3 times a year. We can't let the butchers think that we won't poison them if they step wrong. Butchers are a lot of hard-headed idiots. The stronger the butcher, the more stubborn and stupid. We have to be stubborner and stupider. He laughed again and patted my shoulder, but gently. He didn't feel like a butcher. It wasn't uncomfortable and intense like it was with other butchers. You really did join our little gang. Is it living up to your expectations? I swallowed and whispered. That depends what you have to eat.
I'm starving.
He turned and gestured to the top table, a small square with only one person. Standing behind it, a man with long dark hair falling over the shoulder of his long coat. CM, can we hurry it up? We're getting hungry. The CM only nodded and gestured to Orion, who was still standing by the door, arms folded over his chest. Orion caught my eye and gave me a flicker of a smile before he strode between tables up the 6 tiers to the CM. Orion stood in front of the table, bowed his head, and led all the butchers in prayer. The silence around his words was profound, like even the crackling fire went quiet while Orion spoke. When he raised his head, his eyes came back to me and I smiled at him. For a second, with him on the other side of the room looking at me, I felt like I was precisely where I was supposed to be, as weird as it was. Then we ate. And I will have to say that the exquisite food I'd been eating at Calder was nothing compared to the feast prepared by the finest bakers in the world, led by the immortal Landry. Not that he was actually immortal, vampire, and all that, but what did I know? There was something very vampiric about the way we sucked the life out of the butchers. I glanced over at Orion, where he leaned against the wall beside the CM, watching over the rest of the butchers while we ate. After a few minutes, the CM gestured him sharply to sit beside him. Orion met my eyes, and for a moment I wanted to tell him no, that I would run down to the kitchen and make something for him because he was my butcher, but I managed to resist the impulse. He sat and slowly ate, still eyeing me as if to say that this is not what he wanted in his mouth. I faced forward, gripping my fork because everything had happened too quickly. I wasn't used to Orion looking at me like that in public, as though he didn't care what anyone else thought of me, of us. Try the duck, Landry said, forking me an enormous drumstick. I smiled slightly, and then suddenly all the bakers were suggesting the best dishes, piling bits of this side and that sauce, this cut and that delicacy, until I had 5 plates in front of me. I started laughing. It was too much, but at the same time it felt like a hug. A lot of hugs, and every single bite was the best thing in the world. While we ate, butcher boys and a few older butchers performed feats of grace and agility like aerials and backflips, or waved fire around as they danced about the bonfire. Apparently butchers liked fire and long hair. I studied the butchers on the top levels closest to the walls. They were all so different. Some were really old, older than my dad had been. There was one particularly scarred man who didn't take any pleasure in the feast. He stared around as though there were traitors among us. The butchers around him left plenty of space. Who's that? I whispered to Landry. Marlowe. He's less nervous now than he was 20 years ago. That was possible? Strange. I caught Sebastian staring at me and gave him a slight smile. He lifted his goblet in my direction. I raised mine, but less enthusiastically. I was still a little bit furious with my brother. More than a little bit. But he was my brother, the only family I had left. No, my uncle. Vincent sat at one of the tables furthermost from the bonfire with Aunt Lottie sitting beside him. She looked strangely at home in the black high-collared blouse, clutching a knife as she carved her roast duck. She turned to Vincent and smiled before she said something that got a flash of smile from him. This was their family. They're proud of you, Puffer murmured as he leaned over to refill my glass. I know they're not the most demonstrative couple, but they're proud as punch. With you too. I nodded at him and tried to smile, but seeing them happy made me miss my parents. Lottie and Vincent hadn't tried to be proud of us before we'd been accepted by the butchers. My mother, what would she think of this? She'd kept this world from me, leaving me unprepared. No, she'd taught me to take energy from my dad and bake it into things for Sebastian. She'd taught me without my knowledge until I'd somehow become so awesome. Everyone said so. Feeling a little bit sick, I pushed my plate away and stood. Landry stood with me, and the rest of the bakers soon followed. I didn't mean to, I trailed off as Landry put his hand on my shoulder. We must prepare for tonight's hunting, Landry announced. He leaned over to me. This part might be slightly uncomfortable for you, but you'll get used to. I've been looking forward to tasting your brother. What? He stepped ahead, linking my arm with his, so I trailed behind him. With his other hand, he slid his fingers over the skin of the butchers at the nearest table. He walked slowly, giving the butchers plenty of time to move their hair aside to reveal the skin of necks or roll up sleeves and raise their hands, exposing their forearms. Landry's hand slid over skin and his body began to hum. I could feel him, feel the energy he soaked from the butchers with complete indifference to which butcher's energy he took. He headed towards the table where the CM had already revealed his neck and both forearms. How much skin did he need? A lot, apparently, because every single baker touched him, drawing his strength into them. But Landry, who glanced at me and nodded me ahead to touch the CM. I'd rather not, I whispered. The CM looked up at me, surprised and amused. I saw that expression on Orion's face sometimes. It was strange to see it on someone else. Violetta. He stood and the bakers took their hands off him. He extended his hand to me. Welcome to Candlestick Manor. It is your home as long as you will stay. I glanced at Orion where he sat beside the CM. He looked tense. What was I supposed to do? I didn't want to touch another butcher, not like that. But it would be really rude not to shake his hand when he opened his home to me. My mother hadn't raised me to be rude. I tentatively took his hand, but I felt nothing other than warm skin. There was no rush of energy and happiness like I felt with Orion. I let out the breath I was holding, smiled genuinely and said, "Thank you." Stepped back in the direction of Orion and the other bakers pressed around him again. All but Landry, who had abandoned our group to circle around to Sebastian. I watched the scene, Sebastian aware of the baker stalking him, standing stiffly while he waited as Landry got closer, and closer and closer. Nerve-wracking, isn't it? Orion whispered in my ear. I jumped a little bit then shook my head smiling. Is it? Landry didn't touch you. None of the bakers have. They're still pecking the eyes out of your dad. We're a bunch of vultures apparently. Landry finally got to Sebastian, who hastily tilted his head forward and pulled down his collar, but Landry went for his face, pressing his palms to Boss's dark cheeks. Bess arched, gasped, and I gasped with him. I took one step forward, and Orion slid his hand around my waist, pulling me back against him. Landry can be terrifying. I believe that's him punishing your brother for betraying the butchers and becoming a renegade. Don't worry, Tansetta will remember it fondly. My brother went boneless, slumping down to the table. I turned in Orion's arms and found his face close to mine, so close. Is he unconscious? No, just relaxed. Landry is very efficient at taking energy out of butchers. After some time you'll become more efficient as well. I cocked my head. Are you saying that you don't like the way I take your energy? He bit his bottom lip, sharp white teeth that should be pressed against mine. I am saying that I didn't like the CM touching you. I'm saying that I don't want another baker to touch me. I'm saying. He grabbed my hands and squeezed my fingers as he lifted them up to his lips. He pressed his mouth against them. I felt a rush of life flow into me, more and more as he stared into my eyes above my hands. I gripped him back, swaying towards him while his energy filled me. I wanted more. I needed more. Orion's lips were hard on my knuckles. When Landry touched my shoulder. Enough, Violetta. You wouldn't want to bring our fearless butcher to his knees. Or perhaps you do, but probably somewhere private where you can take advantage of him more thoroughly. I pulled away from Orion, but he hung on for a moment, his eyes melting into me before he let go and straightened, lips soft and delicious. My knuckles buzzed from his kiss. Are you okay? I asked Orion, fisting my hand in my skirt so I wouldn't touch him again. He smiled at me, a slow, languid smile that reminded me of waking up in his warm bed. Violetta, I am much improved. I'll be even better after you feed me. Whatever your delicious hands prepare. This is the part where Landry takes you to the kitchen. Do you mind? You're safe with him. I promise. Safer than she is with you. Are those teeth marks in her knuckles? Landry murmured. Come on, love. Let's get cooking. I let Landry lead me away, down the wide tiers to the broad floor around the bonfire that still snapped and danced. As I went, butchers looked at me with what I would have called hunger. I stopped meeting eyes and hurried after Landry and Chapter 2. Butcher. She's staying in your old room, the CM said to me, looking tired as though a horde of hungry bakers had sucked the life out of him. They'd repay him though soon enough. I nodded and put my hands in my pockets. None of the other bakers had touched me. I wasn't sure why. Landry had made certain Violetta barely took the edge off my reserves. I wanted to give her more, so much more. You will not be staying in your old room, my father added as though that point needed clarification. Landry insisted that she stay in the tower, because it's the most defensible place in Candlestick, but also insisted that you hand over your keys. He held out his hand as though I had the old keys to the back door and the key to my bedroom on me. I sighed as I took my car keys out of my pocket and removed those keys from my keyring. It's almost as if you didn't trust me. He smiled slightly. I don't, but I know that a few keys aren't going to keep you from seeing her. You can scale the wall with your eyes closed and she will let you in the window. She's lovely. He added that last part with a slight frown. I frowned in return. Yes. The other butchers. He glanced around at the hungry butchers waiting impatiently for the baker's goods. I agree with Landry. She needs protection. What she did last night was nothing short of miraculous. Whoever set up last night's debacle won't be happy about her. I nodded. While she's baking, I'm going to track the werewolf, the one that infected the boys. My father's face tightened. That is the priority. Marlowe tracked the dog as far as Border Town. You should ask the local pack leader to be your escort. I frowned at him. He seemed to enjoy throwing me and my dead-to-me brother together. Of course, it was the most logical thing to do. Armand could get things out of a werewolf no butcher ever could. Also, take Sebastian. I raised my eyebrows as I glanced to the huge man who was slumped in his seat, looking dazed and dull. His first encounter with a real baker. Landry left him mostly unresponsive. I'm not sure I'll be able to get anything out of him. My father smiled and stood, pushing back his chair. He walked over to the baker's table where they'd left the remains of their meal. I couldn't remember the bakers being so quick at any other feasts, but of course Violetta had tried to leave, and once one left they all had to go. They were like a pack of sheep. Dangerous, fanged, clawed, vicious sheep that fed on the wolves. None of the other butchers dared to take anything from that table, not unless a baker specifically said so. There were rules. Bakers ate first. Butchers ate what bakers told them to eat. Nothing more, nothing less. I wanted so much to eat nothing other than what Violetta fed me, but I settled for the plates the CM offered me, and eating from one as I walked through the tables, even though Violetta hadn't taken very much strength out of me, down the wide tiers to Sebastian. I put the food in front of him and he fell on it like a starved puppy. Good. He still had strength to eat. Not that Landry would really suck the life out of him. Landry was precise in everything he did. If you can walk, come with me. Eat on the way. I turned and nodded to Marlowe before I took the 2 freshly filled plates a butcher boy brought me that the CM had sent from his place on the top tier. The CM hadn't touched a bite. This was official food for an official job. Sebastian stood and barely wove on his feet before he grinned at me. What do I call you? Boss? Master? Class president? That tone of voice, the slight mocking with his twisted lips. I was going to have to be very patient. Not that I wasn't perfectly patient with my butchers, but he was starting from scratch without the years of following orders and obtaining the discipline necessary to be an effective butcher. And he was very gifted. He would be arrogant, careless, then learn some lessons and be less careless for a little while until he forgot again. That's what trainees did. And he was my trainee. Orion will be sufficient. Daughtry, if you can't pronounce my first name. Turned and walked out quickly. The sooner we got this taken care of, the sooner I could return and taste Violetta's baking. What would she make for me? I sniffed the air, but I couldn't smell anything besides smoke from the fire. Trying to smell my sister? Would I have to get used to him talking? I wasn't really big on talking. Her baked goods. I didn't like the way you did that, kissing her fingers like you were about to bite them off. We were in the hall and walked beneath the bright chandelier. She didn't object. Of course not. The great Orion Daughtry can do whatever he wants. I glanced over at him, his contemptuously curled lips beneath his pale green eyes, Violetta's eyes. Can he? He sounds like a lucky guy. I turned and shoved him against the wall, my forearm at his throat while I stared him down. Do not address me in the third person. I dislike it. As you've just noted, I get what I want. What I want is not nearly as important to me as what she desires. Your sister. She is my baker. I will allow you to talk of her because she is your sister, but be very careful what you say. Marlowe made a sound just to remind me that he was there because he didn't care if I beat the puppy into submission or not. I pulled away from Sebastian and took a vicious bite out of the duck that I could have sworn was on Violetta's plate. Could I taste her lips on them? Imagine that I did, but it was probably wishful thinking. The food was very good. The best. The bakers always got the best, not that they needed it. Out of respect. We needed to make certain our bakers were happy because an unhappy baker didn't make good bread. I wanted to make Violetta very, very happy and not just for her bread. We left the house and I walked the few steps to vault into the car. Sebastian hurried after me, graceful in spite of his long limbs. It still startled me to look at him and see his transformation. He was an excellent specimen of butcher, or he would be if I had the patience to train him properly. Tancetta always knew how to stretch my patience. Marlowe nodded at me before he headed into the garage. He'd already given me the address where he'd left the trail. Can we play some music? Sebastian asked after a few minutes of silence.
No.
He scowled at me, petulant and annoyed. Why not? I kept my face smooth instead of scowling back. We are hunting a werewolf. It's essential that one's mind is free from distractions. He made a rude sound. It's not music that's distracting you. It was so difficult not to snap at him. Focus, I droned, starts before the task you set out to accomplish. Clarity of mind begins with purity of heart. I saw the way you look at my sister. I wouldn't call it pure. I glanced at him, then back through the windshield. My hands held the steering wheel far too tight. I analyzed my feelings, the anger, the frustration, the desire. I had to ignore the truth of his words because he laced them with aggression. Truth was truth. I did not run from anything uncomfortable, even that. Perhaps that's why I crave silence. I have found it difficult to focus ever since meeting your sister. I haven't struggled so much in my role since I first accepted the calling. He was quiet for a minute. Why are you doing it? Isn't it dangerous to be with a baker? Olivia was telling me how stupid it was, but you wouldn't do anything that put Vi at risk, would you? My jaw tightened in spite of him finally sounding earnest instead of derisive. Most of the dangerous outcomes between butcher and baker being romantically involved come from lack of discipline and support. Landry and the CM are determined to protect her, even from me if necessary. That gives me some peace of mind, but I still worry. It's not entirely safe. The more energy she draws from me, the more I want her to take, and the hungrier I become. The danger is actually far greater for me than her. That's a comfort. He laughed and shook his head. So, she could drain you completely until you were dead. I nodded. And you like that? Very much. You're sick. I frowned at him. Referring to my mental health crosses the line. I can't allow you or any butcher to disrespect me. If you had become a baker, you could call me whatever you want. You chose to become a butcher, so know your place. He grinned at me, his white teeth bright against his dark skin. That's almost tempting, draining you like Landry did to me. I apologize, Master Orion, leader of butchers and second to none. I'm second to the CM. He rolled his eyes. Are you always so literal? You must bore Violetta to death. Boredom is not the risk she faces in my company. If you are bored from talking with me, you could consider silence as an alternative. Open your mind. Concentrate on your senses, particularly smell, but others as well. If you can, be aware of energy. It helps a great deal with tracking. He sighed but shut up and seemed to be sniffing the air as we drove with the top of my black Corvette down. Maybe I was boring. I didn't really know very much about what interested Violetta. She'd either been pretending to be her brother or pretending to be a girly girl, so I didn't suspect her. I cleared my throat. I'd worked so hard to shut him up. Sebastian, what does your sister like? He opened his eyes and looked at me, a slow smile working over his face. I did not like that smile. She loves being told what her place is as a woman, and that it's in the kitchen. I raised an eyebrow. Landry's sister is a baker, but all the other bakers I've met are men. I'm afraid I haven't got a chance at pigeonholing her that way. Pity. What else? He frowned at me. You really want to know? I gave him a short nod. I'll tell you something about her, but you have to give me something in return. That knife. he said, nodding at my belt where I wore a very nice dagger my mother had given me for my 11th birthday. I removed it and tossed it to him. There's an armory at Candlestick Manor. You can check out any number of weapons for any amount of time. You're really going to enjoy that part of being a butcher. He grinned at me as he ran his thumb along the blade. Yeah, I am. Violetta is a pain about things like honesty, duty, discipline, and she always follows the rules. That's why I couldn't believe she'd ever take my place at Calder. She must have hated lying to everyone. She despises being lied to. She likes honesty, probably because she didn't get much of it. When I discovered my dad's cache of weapons and started practicing with them, my dad took me aside and explained about the natural urges of a boy to kill things, which isn't natural for the record. None of my friends' parents had weapons and none of them wanted to throw knives at cats. After I'd asked half a dozen friends about their parents' weapons, my parents finally brought me in on the whole hidden world. My dad helped me hold a weapon, not chop off my own fingers. That sort of thing. I wasn't allowed to talk to Vi about it. My mother was an awesome, super sweet lady who never raised her voice, but at the idea of Vi knowing about that world, she totally lost it. I've never been so scared in my life. I swallowed. Honesty? I lied about knowing she was a boy for a long time. But she was lying to you, so it probably didn't count. But from here on out, you lie to her, she'll hate you forever. She seriously knows how to hate someone forever. She's mad at me right now. Yeah, I shouldn't have left her without a butcher. I didn't say anything because if he said it, I didn't have to. No, he shouldn't have left her without a butcher. But if he hadn't, I wouldn't have met her and we wouldn't be where we were. I blinked, which was at the exit I had to take. I veered over, tires screeching, crossing 2 lanes to make the exit. See, I said, pulling up at a stoplight. Distractions are dangerous. I really needed to focus. Tracking was not just scent. It was more following. Intention, getting inside the mind of your prey, and the scent or a track was only validation to prove you were on the right trail. I drove slowly through the city until the streets were shabby, north until I got to the old lot behind the rundown brick building Marlowe had given me the address for. Hopefully the wolf Marlowe had entrusted the site to hadn't forgotten what he was doing and marked it all up. After a minute or two, Marlowe pulled into the lot on his motorbike. Sebastian and I got out of the car to meet him. Armand materialized from the deep shadows inside, arms across his chest. Took you long enough, he snapped, eyes bright and golden. It's a holiday. Let's cut the charming chit-chat short. Is the wolf who infected my boys one of yours? I asked. Armand cocked his head and showed me his teeth. I'd actually trusted him to guard Violetta last night. I must have been out of my mind. My pack doesn't usually have a death wish. The trail leads this way. He nodded to the side and started at a quick jog. I followed, my boots thumping. While Armand's made no sound, I thumped louder for a little while just to make the differences between us more apparent. Armand glanced at me and smiled sharply. Trying to wake the dead? Marlowe grunted. Are you sure this is the right trail? Did you have some of your boys track it already? I can't sense anything from the original. Armand sneered. They aren't my boys. I'm not a butcher. Otherwise I'd be stomping along like Mr. Daughtry. Marlowe, how is the rheumatism? He grunted and jogged along, but he didn't look particularly pleased to be there. Not that he'd ever complain. I slowed down and fell in beside Marlowe. I'd like you to circle back and check around the building for a sidetrack. I'm not sure I trust that wolf to lead us. He grunted and turned on a dime, heading back where we'd come. He didn't slow down. I shook my head for a moment before I stretched my legs to catch up with Armand and Sebastian. We were an odd group of runners in our black coats, except Armand, who wore jeans and a t-shirt, managing to look disreputable with his unshaven chin. Butcher trying to take care of Marlowe? How touching. I growled at Armand. He laughed, flashing his grin in my direction again. You smell like vanilla and jasmine. Must have bathed in it this morning. I'd taken a shower after I'd spent the night watching Violetta sleep in my bed. I growled again. You're talking about my sister? There was a warning in Sebastian's voice. Armand glanced at him with a flash of curiosity before he smirked back at me. 2 for the price of 1. What an excellent deal. Looks like this one's a bit of trouble, but not nearly as much as her. I spun around on him. Is this a new tracking technique you're developing? You can't keep your muzzle shut, I'll close it for you. Permanently. He grinned and crouched. Is that so? Seems like you're all mouth. I swung at him slow and high. He dodged easily and blocked my kick. Spoon. Around and slammed my shoulder into his chest, knocking him back into a brick wall. I hadn't fought him in a long time. Felt so good. He twisted beneath me and brought his elbow up in a move he'd taught me when I was 8. I laughed as I hooked his knee, and we both tumbled to the pavement. He punched my face and I returned the favor, but stayed away from his mouth. Talk about mouthy. All those teeth. His eyes never shifted, but he was laughing when the fight finally left me and I rolled away from him and into a crouch, breathing heavily. And that's why we don't let him wander off on his own, Marlowe said in a dry, bored voice. I looked over at him where he stood beside Sebastian. You're back. Did you find another lead? He shook his head. This is the trail. Without the pack leader to throw off the scent, it was easy to trace our wolf. Sebastian stood there clenching and unclenching his fists while I wiped blood off my mouth. I inhaled deeply. Excellent. Shall we? I continued in a jog, letting Armand lead the way. He moved light and springy. Werewolves were so springy. Sebastian fell in beside me. What was that? He muttered under his breath. Perhaps so Armand and Marlowe wouldn't hear. Was he sparing my feelings? Butchers shouldn't lose track of their goals so they could fight with an ally. It wasn't like me. He helped us last night. I said like that explained anything. Yeah, so that means you fight him? I didn't kill him. I didn't even pull a knife. Werewolves fight as a sign of respect. He ran alongside me for a moment. I almost killed him. You didn't look like you needed help, but you let his teeth get so close to your face. Did I? I've had werewolf teeth much closer. It's not the face you need to worry about but the throat. I'll be sure to remember that. It's fine if a werewolf bites my face. So good to know. He shut up after that, but I was left wondering what that had been. We'd fought and wrestled like a couple of puppies. I couldn't trust Armand, not when he was a werewolf. He'd abandoned me and everything I fought for and believed in. But he felt like my brother. He felt like he missed me as much as I missed him. I shook my head and focused. The scent grew stronger and stronger until it was stifling and mixed with another smell I knew very well. We ran along the river's edge past a row of nondescript gray storage buildings. The scent drew us on and even Sebastian's nose was wrinkled when we turned the corner between buildings and stopped spread out, knives ready as we moved towards the gray bundle in the middle of the alley. For a moment I thought it was the old grizzled wolf from down south, but it was smaller, younger, and it was hard to tell anything else about the creature that had been ripped to shreds and mostly eaten. I stopped moving, as did Armand and Sebastian. Marlowe continued to the body, head extended as he sniffed. I've never smelled that kind of monster before. There've been vampires around here maybe, drawn by the blood, but they didn't stick around. I walked forward, staying away from the body while I crouched and brushed the ground with my fingers. Or it's a vampire that's gotten very good at not looking like one. A vampire that eats werewolves. Sebastian glanced at me. Mel had been controlled by a vampire. Why would a vampire want to look like a werewolf? Could be crazy. Lots of crazy vampires, Marlowe said drily. That would explain the eating. Sebastian took another step closer, then turned and left, walking briskly out of the alley. I frowned after him, then looked at Armand. Can you identify it? No. I've memorized the teeth of our pack for identification, and this dog is not one of mine. Are you going to check on the puppy? He's fine. This death reminds me a lot like the way his parents were slaughtered. I stared at Armand and muttered a curse under my breath. Think of something interesting to tell me when I get back. I turned and walked back towards the river to find Sebastian crouching beside it after having thrown up. Charming. I crouched next to him and handed him a handkerchief. You've seen gore. You're a butcher, so blood shouldn't bother you. You have instincts deep in your DNA that you haven't learned how to harness. Whatever you're thinking or feeling is important, relevant, and possibly helpful. Don't shut down the emotions. They'll shut themselves down soon enough. Talk. He glared at me, his bloodshot eyes confused and disoriented. I don't know. Just felt lost. So lost, betrayed, and hopeless. I felt like I failed the most important thing I've ever tried to do. I nodded. Good. Did you feel the weight of responsibility? He nodded and blinked back, tears in his pale green eyes. I failed. I put my hand on his shoulder and felt it, the emotions, the weight, the agony of failure far eclipsing the pain and fear of imminent death. The wolf's death. Sebastian had managed to soak up the emotions of the werewolf's last moment. Fantastic. You're reliving his death. That happens sometimes with butchers. It's not pleasant but extremely useful. I blame Landry for this. He's extremely good at preparing his butchers for exactly what he needs them to do. He glanced up at me. His butchers. I smiled and pushed up from his shoulder, then hauled him upright. Landry would disagree, but the CM would not. Armand says that this is very similar to the way your parents died. I spoke without hesitation, like it wasn't a horrible thing to say. He had to want to get to the bottom of their murders as much as I did. Unless he felt responsible in some way. Would that explain his emotions, his being so attuned to this murder? Did he know this murderer personally? You're saying that I worked with my parents' killer. He still sounded unbalanced and unstable from the victim's emotions. I raised my eyebrow. I'm saying that Armand thinks that this killer might be the same as the one that killed your parents. If you feel guilt for going about avenging their deaths all the wrong ways, that's something you need to face and deal with. In my eyes, you're a butcher's boy, and you're going to have to prove your dedication just like any other, but I don't hold your decision to become a renegade against you. He studied his hands for a moment, opening and closing his enormous palms. Why not? You're right. You warned me that I'd be fighting to undo all the damage I'd done, and I did. I'm really worried about the seal. I rubbed my chin. What did the CM tell you about it? He glanced at me and I sighed. You didn't tell the CM. He shifted uncomfortably. I'm not used to being a butcher, to feeling the heaviness, the duty. I always wanted to be a butcher. I wanted to feel normal. To not be alone, to have a family, but I didn't expect to feel responsible. That's why I don't hold your past against you. The butcher in you has awakened, and you will feel the call to slay the darkness in this world and inside of yourself. We all have our demons, our regrets, and it doesn't get easier that you started with such regrets. I shook my head. I trust that you'll do your part. The butchers need you. When we get back, I'll talk to the CM with you about the seal. He inhaled shakily and nodded, but made no move to stand. I put my hand on his shoulder for a moment and felt that connection before I headed back into the alley to examine the grisly body. We got back to Candlestick Manor later than I'd hoped, but when I went into the kitchen, Landry had a lovely stack of cold pancakes waiting for me. Pancakes? He shrugged. She was exhausted after making this lot, so I sent her to bed. You'll eat these, go butchering, then come back in the morning and let her take your energy. I hesitated. If she was exhausted, I should go to her now, give her my strength at that very moment, and perhaps stay with her through the night. Blinked and shook my head. I had so much to do, not the least of which was encouraging Sebastian to talk to the CM about the broken seal. Sounded pretty ominous, but I didn't know anything about it. I knew that darkness was drawn and captured into the area north of the city, that butchers had been called to protect humans from and contain these shadowlands. I didn't know all the technical aspects. That's what CMs were for. I didn't want to get involved in this sort of thing. Armand was the one who my father had been preparing as the next CM, not me. I shrugged, inhaled the pancakes, which were officially my favorite breakfast food, even if I ate them at 8 p.m. I got up and went to find Sebastian, to drag him to my father. That wasn't too bad, actually. My father took over the difficult task of keeping Sebastian from talking about the wrong things and making certain that Sebastian felt balance between guilt and responsibility, so he told what he knew instead of holding it inside, buried beneath guilt. The CM made it sound like breaking seals wasn't all that big of a deal, but I knew him, and by the tightness in his eyes and the way his smile strained, this was a bad thing. A very, very bad thing. Sebastian talked about following the cloaked leader into the North City, past the occupied lots to where it was nothing besides overgrown cars and random walls that hadn't yet gotten knocked down. They'd gone down into a cellar in the middle of a field where there must have been a former house, and then through the cellar down and down through these natural caverns until they were in underground caverns with sloping walls and stalagmites. It was creepy. The creepiest part was where Sebastian and Tony cut their hands and let their blood drip onto this big copper lid that looked like one of those city water facility caps. That seemed like a good idea at the time. Sebastian actually said that, and the CM didn't groan or put Sebastian's head on a pike. The CM laughed instead, which was much worse, but Sebastian didn't know that. Those old seals have been around for generations. It's about time we updated them, don't you agree, Orion? I hesitated because if my father asked for my opinion, that usually meant that he was going to make it my responsibility. I said, what do you think, Sebastian? Should we look into improving the efficacy of those old-fashioned plugs? He nodded and smiled like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. I glanced at the CM and he smiled at me. Here it came. Orion, you'll lead the research on the seals and figure out how to make a new batch even more impermeable and resilient to tampering. Sebastian, walk with me. What kind of weapons are you most comfortable with? I was excused, so I left half irritated and half amused. I buzzed from energy. I shouldn't have eaten all those pancakes so quickly, but I was worried that someone else would eat them while I chatted with the CM. I wanted to go up the stairs and pace outside her room, but that wouldn't really be research, and I was the butcher before anything else. The pancakes had tasted heavily of cinnamon. I'd noticed that cinnamon usually meant tracking. Wasn't an exact science, but I'd been eating goods for a long time. Cinnamon would sharpen my senses and strengthen my endurance for long runs over wide stretches. I would bet that after tonight's battle with the darkness, the CM would send me further afield to find the origins of the wolf. I wasn't leaving until I'd touched Violetta and had her feed me with her bare hands. Waking up to her Jello in her fingers was something I desperately wanted to get used to. Maybe, just maybe,